Folks, I want to welcome you to the May meeting of the Kentucky Civil War Roundtable. This marks the end of the Roundtable year. We began, if you'll recall, with a Zoom presentation from Jack Davis. And we've had presentations about the battles of Atlanta and the photography of Atlanta. And then, of course, Pete Carmichael's talk on the common soldier and what made the common soldier what he was. And we're now going to hear from Steve Phan in a few minutes on the Civil War defenses of Washington, D.C. But before we get into the speaker, I thought I would give you a few announcements. One, my wife Genevieve and I like to go visit Charlie Rowland. And Charlie, as you know, is 103. He was a longtime president of the Kentucky Civil War Roundtable, the biographer of Albert Sidney Johnston, and the text on the American Civil War, college text. And Charlie is a wonderful fellow, and I like to keep up with him. And so Jen and I go out and visit him rather often. And I just wanted to report to you that we visited him about, I think 3 weeks ago. And honestly, this fellow at 103, AJ, he was as sharp as a tack. I mean, you could mention any general you wanted in the Western Theater of War, and Charlie would pick up on exactly where that guy was. Now, I hope at 103, I'm capable of doing just a little bit of that.
You're not alone.
But I just want to tell you, our old friend Charlie is doing very, very well, and he lives with his daughter and her husband and family, and they take just exquisite care of Charlie. But he's tough. He is tough. This guy didn't survive the Battle of the Bulge for nothing. I mean, he's a tough fella. So, but then now I have something else I want to talk to you guys about, and that is, as you know, we've been doing Zoom meetings since September, and they've gone very well, and in large measure because of Studio 46. And Ethan Mills, who's behind the machinery that helps all this work. And I've got to tell you, Studio 46 has done a spectacular job with us. And I know you'll concur, AJ. Yes. And but looking ahead, as you probably read in the newsletter, I want to get back to the meetings where we're all there together and enjoying the camaraderie that this roundtable has always been famous for. And so I'm happy to announce that on Monday, September 13, we will be back at the Embassy Suites for our first in-person meeting since the pandemic. And then again on Monday, November 22nd, Monday before Thanksgiving, we'll be back again for another meeting. And I think we should have a great crowd for those meetings, because I think all of you, like me and like AJ, are really itching to get back and do what the Roundtable loves to do, and that is hold forth with lots of camaraderie and chat and everybody catching up. And it's the hallmark of this organization. And so it looks like we're now heading back that way. And just stay in close touch. I also want to tell you that we're getting some new members and these new members are, I want to announce specifically tonight because they're likely watching. The superintendent of Camp Nelson National Monument is Ernie Price, who is a tremendous fellow who came to Camp Nelson from Appomattox Courthouse and is a great Civil War scholar, and is very much interested in Kentucky's role in the Civil War. And he and his assistant out there at Camp Nelson, Emily Libcamp, are planning to join us, and both of them are watching tonight. So we welcome them, and but I want to introduce them to you here, and we'll do it again in person when we meet in September. Well, I'm here with AJ and our illustrious secretary, and I want all of you to know that if you look on your screen, you'll see the word chat. And as this talk progresses, if you have a question, you punch chat, and then you can type in your question. And then that will appear on our screen here in front of us when the talk is concluded, and then we can begin asking the questions that you all have on your mind. And I know you'll have many. So with all that having been said, I think we've covered the waterfront. Do you think so?
We have.
Okay.
We have.
I want to introduce our speaker. I ran across this character just this year. His name and reputation preceded him here. Steve Phan is our speaker, and Steve is a ranger in the National Park Service, and has been the chief of interpretation at the Civil War defenses of Washington. Now, I want you all to, I'm sure many of you know, but the city of Washington was literally ringed with fortresses around it. So absolutely terrified were those people in the federal government that somehow Confederate forces would break into that place. I can remember working on my book on George Meade, how often General Halleck would send a message to a dispatch to George Meade telling him, now make sure you cover Baltimore and Washington. So fearful that Lee would get loose back there, and there would be raids in and out of Washington. And so consequently, there were elaborate defenses constructed. And we're really privileged to have Steve. Steve is an authority on those defenses. And he has a lovely chat for us tonight, talk tonight. And a little bit of his background, besides being a park ranger and historian for the Civil War defenses in Washington, he acted as the chief of interpretation at Camp Nelson National Monument here in Jessamine County. Between, I guess it was January, Steve, and May 7, honestly, we had some terrific times going out to dinner and showing Steve the scenery around Lexington, and he got to visit a lot of our great Civil War sites in Kentucky as well. But he has certainly been around the National Park Service Civil War facilities. He served at the Gettysburg National Military Park. He served at the Richmond National Battlefield Park, the Hopewell Culture National Historic Park, Stones River National Battlefield, Rock Creek Park, Buffalo Soldiers National Monument. And he's an authority and has written articles on Asians and Pacific Islanders in the Civil War. You speak of a niche. Now, that's an interesting niche. He has a master's degree in American history from Middle Tennessee State University, and he's an all-around great guy. And I want to introduce to all of you my great friend, Steve Phan. Steve?
Well, thank you for the introduction. I'm honored. It's good to see you. Excuse me. Good to see you, Kent.
Good to see
nice
you.
to meet you, AJ.
Pleasure to meet you.
It feels like yesterday I was in Lexington, Kentucky, and I guess about 20 miles south in Nicholasville at Camp Nelson National Monument. Had the great privilege to serve as the chief of interpretation, as you said, Kent, from mid-January until early May. And so I just got back to Washington last week and diving back into the defenses of Washington. And for those that I'm sure a lot of people that are a part of the organization have gone to Camp Nelson, there is an elaborate system of fortifications there. And I'll be speaking about the most heavily fortified cities, certainly during the Civil War in the United States. I hear from, we've heard people say that probably one of the most heavily fortified cities in the Western Hemisphere, and I certainly believe that, and likely one of the most heavily fortified cities in the world. So we're going to talk about the defenses of Washington and what Kent talks about, the War Department and the federal government allocating millions of dollars and tons of manpower in defending the national capital. And this is what it looks like. You're going to see a lot of incredible images of the defenses of Washington, certainly from the period. And what we have here today, 160 years later, the legacy of the defenses of Washington continues. So it's quite exciting. And, I really enjoyed being out in Kentucky and viewing those earthworks. They were kind of just a smaller system compared to what we had in Washington. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen now. Ooh. Ethan, can you allow me to share the screen, please? Thank you. Appreciate it. All right, so the capital can't be taken, and that line was actually provided by none other than Lieutenant General Winfield Scott, commanding general of the U.S. Army, in April of 1861, really prior to the fall of Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor and the outbreak of major hostilities across the country. And he's telling this in a meeting to Lincoln and his cabinet. And so I've used this really as the theme of my programs for the past few years. The capital can't be taken. He says that quite assertively, but he also realized that he's going to need quite a bit of men to defend the capital and then fortifications themselves. So the origins, I go back really, I found this account from January of 1861, but I really go back to the election of Abraham Lincoln in November of 1860 and kind of the aftermath, because outgoing President James Buchanan will recall Winfield Scott from New York City to Washington to oversee preparations for Lincoln's inauguration and the safe and transition and transfer of power from his outgoing administration to Abraham Lincoln. So you will see that he'll arrive in mid-December, and obviously he's older and quite infirm, but mentally he's very capable still, and he'll rely on trusted subordinates to ensure that the capital will be protected and that the president will be inaugurated in March of 1861. So I don't know if this sounds familiar, but look at the date, January 15th, from a newspaper in Northern Virginia. General Winfield Scott is still engaged in making preparations to guard against a possible breach of peace in Washington consequent on the present political agitation. Effective military forces are to be posted in several parts of the city. It is not probable that any but regular troops and the militia of the district will be employed for this purpose. So he's going to really rely on elements of the regular army, of course, these career army officers and these career soldiers, but also several companies of the District of Columbia militia. And many of those companies will be reorganized because some of the members are openly hostile to the federal government and will join the Confederacy in the coming months. So I really go back to 1860 November, obviously election of Lincoln and his first vice president, Hannibal Hamlin. Like, who will oversee the protection of the Capitol? And really, it's because of the city location, its proximity to the other states around, of course, the major topography around the Capitol, which I'll be talking about moving forward in the program here. And so they're first really going to rely on troops. This is in the aftermath of Lincoln's inauguration, but really it'll start with militia, elements of the regular army, and then obviously the U.S. volunteers as the war really starts to break out. Really early war image from the summer of 1861 and troops in front of the unfinished Capitol building. But we know that Abraham Lincoln is safely inaugurated in March of 1861. There are federal troops all over the city, District of Columbia militia, as I mentioned, the regular army. General Winfield Scott himself is in a corner near the Capitol building with his staff officers. There are cavalry vedettes roaming the streets, artillery on the major bridges approaching the city. There are soldiers in the rooftops. I found an account from a gentleman that came down from Philadelphia to see the inauguration, and he said he saw soldiers not wearing uniforms, civilian clothes, walking around armed with pistols in the crowd just to ensure everything was going to be peaceful and safe as Lincoln, accepts, really, speaks to the country, first inaugural address, and obviously is sworn into office. And really, so I call that really the first iteration of the defenses of Washington. It really rely on troops, and then as we move forward towards, outbreak of hostilities, we're going to have fortifications constructed. So the Union Shield, as I said, especially in the days leading up to the fall of Fort Sumter and immediately afterward, will rely on really uniformed men, civilians, and soldiers armed with weapons, guarding government property. One of the issues that the War Department has is some of those U.S. Army officers that were at the inauguration will resign after Fort Sumter and join the Confederacy, including a guy like John Magruder. Magruder was in charge of an artillery battery near the Capitol during the inauguration. He'll resign in the coming weeks to join the Confederacy. So you see a lot of resignations, a lack of leadership, of course, and they're trying to rush as many men as they can to the Capitol. They'll send out quotas on April 15th to each state governor not in rebellion for 75,000 volunteers, as we know, of Fort Sumter, to get them to Washington as quickly as possible. And I got to show you this really important map of Washington. It's actually from 1862. One of the early war images of Washington, which I love. You got the national capital itself, the federal city. They call it Washington City. Most importantly is what it's surrounded by. To the south, across the Potomac River, is Virginia, including what they call the Arlington Heights. I always tell people, think about Arlington National Cemetery, the Lee House, the Lee Memorial, and look across the river. It's very strategic high ground that the Army will be very concerned with. The same across what we call the northern defenses. It's the D.C. Maryland border, and then we have this other sector of the line. We now call this the Anacostia River. They also call it the Eastern Branch of course, the mighty Potomac River. And also imagine it as this. This is a big bowl. The rim of the bowl are all the heights around the Capitol, including in Virginia and Maryland. And the bottom of the bowl is the city itself. So the Capitol is incredibly vulnerable. Federal engineers are very fearful that Confederate forces will roll up artillery and shell the Capitol from the Arlington Heights. They can also fire against the Navy Yard and U.S. Arsenal from the Anacostia side as well. And then in 1864, the Confederate Army will come down from Maryland and attack D.C. from the north. So every section every approach of the Capitol will be defended during the course of the war. So starting there in Arlington, all the way down, federal troops will reconnoiter the area, including engineers, and then they are going to seize the initiative, especially what happens with Virginia. Is Virginia going to stay in the Union, or are they going to break away? Federal engineers are prepared for that, and you'll see what they do in late May of 1861. An old battle veteran here, of course, Joseph K. Mansfield, who's mortally wounded at Antietam. He's in charge of the Department of Washington, and he's tasked by Winfield Scott to basically develop a contingency plan if Virginia falls, if Maryland falls to the Confederacy or secedes. And he sends out his engineers. They ride the ground around the Capitol, and they determine that he tells Winfield Scott, if Virginia does break away, we need to cross the Potomac River and occupy Arlington immediately. And that's what's going to happen in May of 1861. And including Irvin McDowell's Army of Occupation. This will be done on May 23rd, 1861. 3 columns of federal troops will cross the Potomac River, occupy Arlington, and then even riverborne troops will take Alexandria the following day. And literally, they'll start building earthworks. As early as late May of 1861, the U.S. Army is constructing earthworks around the Capitol, which is absolutely incredible. That's a very early war date. And you can see the Washington Evening Star with this report. It's one of my favorites from the entire story of the defenses of Washington, because you realize how early this is. Obviously, this is post Fort Sumter. There's already been the 90 days troops in Washington. So Washington, the city, is relatively secure from, like an infantry incursion, but not from artillery. So the United States forces are now busily throwing up fortifications on the heights on the Virginia shore. So really, that is the founding of the defenses of Washington. They'll construct about a half dozen forts on the Virginia side, all the way down to Alexandria. I kind of call these forward operating bases. They're protecting the approaches to Washington, especially along the bridges. They're covering the high ground, and federal forces occupy this area for the remainder of the war, which is absolutely critical. And you can see 90-day militia troops, that we believe these troops are from New Jersey, using picks, shovels, and are building up walls of dirt. We call these earthworks, temporary fortifications used to protect the capital. Here's a really great image of Fort Runyon, also built by New Jersey troops. The largest fort built in the entire system of defenses, sitting on the present day Pentagon, actually. And really importantly, it sat right off a long bridge, which was the key avenue of approach from Virginia into Washington. And there's also a rail line that crossed the bridge as well. So heavily defended during the course of the war. And you can see the Army started building fortifications on, of course, high ground, strategic areas, avenues of approach to the city. And you can see right here, the fort sitting right on top of the hill. That's Fort Ellsworth, right in Alexandria, Virginia. And the Masonic Temple there is actually there today, named in honor of Elon Farnsworth, Ellsworth, who will fall pretty early after occupation of Alexandria. So one really important thing to understand is the defenses of Washington evolved dramatically over the course of the war. And you're going to see what I'm talking about. Kent mentioned, General Meade in the Gettysburg campaign, and, he's got to protect Washington and Baltimore. And the number of troops in Washington, I'll mention how much that grows and how the forts become bigger and they add larger guns. All that will happen during the course of the war. Early war image of Fort Corcoran, one of the most important sites in Northern Virginia. You can see this is an early war image because it's like really a stockade, something that you would see out in the American West, with the U.S. Army posts back then. The majority, almost all the forts, of course, were made out of earth. But this is kind of an early war system that will be enhanced dramatically by 62 and 1863. And of course, what really spurs the evolution and the rapid building of the forts is George McClellan. Obviously, he'll be called out to Washington after the first Battle of Manassas or Bull Run in July of 1861. And by the way, the forts served their purpose. There's about a half dozen, as I said earlier. And as McDowell's army is retreating from Manassas and towards D.C., General Winfield Scott tells his commanders to retreat to the protections of the fort's guns. So they'll remain in Northern Virginia. Some troops will be in the city, of course. And when McClellan arrives in late July, you're going to see a rapid expansion of the defenses of Washington. And we'll talk about that number moving forward. So we call this the art of fortification. Army engineers, especially John G. Barnard, he becomes the chief engineer of the defenses of Washington under George McClellan. He also was a staff officer under Joseph Mansfield, so he was around reconnoitering the ground prior to the federal occupation in Northern Virginia. And he'll become, I call him the father of the defenses of Washington. He's a West Pointer, a career Army engineer, an absolutely brilliant man. And he's going to oversee this design and implementation of the defenses of Washington. And by the end of the first year, there are 48 forts encircling Washington. That's right, 48. And about 300 to 400 artillery pieces. And this will only get bigger as we get further and deeper into the war. So, as I said, he's a career Army officer, West Pointer. He's going to rely on the treaties of fortifications that was created at West Point that talks about the development of the defenses of Washington. And this is what General Barnard says. To meet the emergency, listen closely, the emergency, right? This rebellion, of course, works were necessarily thrown out without the deliberate study of the topography on which the establishment of such a defensive line should, if practicable, be used. The first directions given to our laborers were to secure the roads, not merely as the beaten highways of travel from the country to the city, but as, in general, occupying the best ground for an enemy's approach. What I think is really important about that statement from General Barnard is to meet the emergency, works were necessarily thrown out without that deliberate study of the topography. And they're going to realize that the forts in many places were placed in the wrong position. They were not built substantially large enough. They lacked enough firepower from artillery pieces. The original artillery pieces were antiquated. There were major blind spots in the lines. That will all be remedied following 1862, especially after Lee's invasion of Maryland, when the federal engineers are like, oh my gosh, the northern fences are way too weak. We have to enhance these. And so when I talk about the evolution of the forts, that's exactly what I mean. The forts seem static, but they're really not. They're going to evolve and expand depending on what happens on the battlefield. And here's kind of an image that blew up. It's a little bit difficult to see, but you see some soldiers there. And my great friend, MPS historian and earthwork expert David Lowe, he calls earthworks an excavation. And that's what these soldiers are doing. It's really soldiers that build the original forts, and then you'll have civilian labor and then even formerly enslaved laborers, African Americans finding refuge in DC, who will expand the forts later on in the war. But they're really just taking picks, shovels, and just piling up dirt to build these walls. They're cutting down trees to clear fields of fire, and you're going to have the beginning of the earthwork system around Washington. And I think this is a really great diagram of the defenses of Washington from the side view and from like a bird's eye view as well. You've got the main parapet itself. We'll talk about bomb proofs moving forward. There's a ditch around the forts about 6 feet deep. The glossy is this slope in front of the wall, which shields the wall from artillery fire. If you're coming up from the bottom of the hill, it's hard to even see the top of the fort because of the glossy. The abattis, I call that 19th century barbed wire. And you'll see a better image of this moving forward. From the bird's eye view, you see they say it's moat, but it's actually a dry ditch. The embrasures are where the cannons are cutting out of the wall. We have those at we have the at Camp Nelson. If you go out to see some of the fortifications there, you will see the embrasures in the wall. So kind of a pretty cool sketch there, but you'll see the historic images in a second. And what I love about the defenses of Washington is they all had engineering designs and blueprints, okay? So this is Fort Lyon in Virginia, actually at the Huntington Metro Station. And you can see all forts are shaped a little bit differently, basically adhering to the ground they sit on. And you've got these dramatic designs here. And you're going to have multiple fields of fire for anyone that attacks the fort. Hence why you have these, what we call flanking walls. If the enemy's attacking from this direction, they're taking fire from multiple flanks along the wall and the ditch, and then obviously frontal fire. Bomb proofs that men could go into if they're under enemy fire. And magazines where they stored the ammunition. The sally port is the rear entrance of the fort. You can see the abattis around the ditch there. You can see it says felled trees. This actually had a major accident where some German soldiers were trying to clean out some cannonballs, and there was a major explosion at one of the magazines, killing dozens of troops. And what I love about this image here is Fort Pennsylvania. It's later renamed Fort Reno, located in Northwest Washington, near the town of modern-day Tenleytown. You have the main fort proper itself. It's important to understand that the soldiers did not stay in the forts. They just trained and built them, but they lived outside of the forts. And I found this in the Library of Congress, and I love the little key or legend you have here. I call this like a mini Olympic village because it has everything that the soldiers needed, right? And obviously the numbers here correlate with what's on what they call the explanation. So you have the wagons tent, hospital department, officers, stable, chaplain's tent, headquarters, kitchen, private's tent, quartermaster, right? All located generally to the rear of the fort. If I recall, Fort Reno was pretty big. It took up at least 70 acres of land. I mean, dramatic. So think about the effect that federal soldiers had on the landscape, environmental effect. The effect on the natural landscape was pretty dramatic over the course of the war. Okay, so this is probably my favorite images of the defenses of Washington. This is located in Northeast DC, actually a relatively small size fort. Kind of the size of Fort Jones over at Camp Nelson in the eastern section of the park there. Less than a 100-yard perimeter. and you see every element of the defenses of Washington. And let me read this to you from the Army engineering publication called The Art of Fortification, and they describe earthworks this way. And listen closely. The profile of these forts consisted of an earthen parapet from 12 to 18 feet thick, the thickness depending on exposure. So that's the parapet. This gigantic wall here, these walls, 12 to 18 feet thick. The interior slope was revetted, and we'll talk about revetments. Look at these wooden planks right there. Those are revetments. While the exterior slope was allowed to take the natural slope of the earth, that's that natural slope of the earth right there. You can see it curved down towards the hill. That's called the scarp. At the bottom of the exterior slope proper, there was a narrow berm. And there is the berm. You see this little flat piece of ground at the bottom of the scarp that keeps the wall from falling into the ditch. It's literally flat across, about a foot wide. You can see it right there. The profile is absolutely spectacular. But there you have the berm, outside of which there was a ditch at least 6 feet in depth. We talk about the ditch. You can really see the ditch right there, a little bit off to the east there as well, but 6 feet deep. Outside of the ditch, the ground was graded as to form a glacis with a narrow covered way fitted occasionally as an infantry parapet. There's the glacis. It literally just goes downhill, as I said, covering the approaches to the fort. On the glacis or at its foot, there was usually built an abattis. The abattis, obviously, all these felled tree branches right here covering the ditch. Imagine you're attacking uphill over open ground. You're taking artillery fire, and then you have to get through the abattis into the ditch, and then you have to scale the wall itself. Obviously, a very difficult task. When first constructed, the interior slope was revetted with planks, but these proved to have so little durability, and that's what they're talking about. These wooden revetments, and you see this at Fort Putnam at Camp Nelson. These were put in to reinforce the walls to keep the parapet in place. They were later replaced by a revetment consisting of vertical posts capped by horizontal logs which were tied back to the parapet. And you're going to see what that looks like in another image moving forward. So you see all the different feature of forts here, and they're going to be kind of universal around the country, especially for the federal armies. You're going to see them at Camp Nelson. You're going to see them at Knoxville. You're going to see them around Pittsburgh. Obviously, the defenses of Washington, Harper's Ferry, they're built off this design created by the Army engineers at West Point. And obviously, you can see the Sally Port there and elements of the 2nd PA heavy artillery marching through. Early war image. What about the soldiers? Well, we know the soldiers stayed in these dramatic, large Sibley tents. You can see the forts right on top of the hill there. That's Fort Bunker Hill, which is actually managed by the National Park Service today. But look how open the landscape is. This is now the Brookland neighborhood in D.C. It's just a community neighborhood, a bunch of houses, some schools, and things like that. But here as well, you can see the evolution of the defenses from these Sibley tents. This is a very famous image. I'm sure a lot of people have seen this. This was Queen's Farm near Bunker Hill, Fort Bunker Hill, 1861, elements of a Pennsylvania regiment, I think the 34th 1st PA. And you can tell it's an early war image, a soldier with his children, his wife, and even a dog. I mean, early war image, of course. There are several accounts of family members joining their soldiers in the defenses of Washington throughout the course of the war. So I really love showing these early war images because you see how much the forts will change and expand. And you're going to go from that to this. This is an 1865 image south of Fort Stevens where the main battle took place. And you can see those tents will be replaced by all these wooden barracks. And there was a kitchen there. There was a field hospital, a hospital building there that was used by the 6th Corps during the battle in July of 1864. But you see, not a bad assignment if you can get it, right? The Army, listen to this number, according to General Barnard, cut down 20,000 acres of trees around Washington during the Civil War. Obviously, clear fields of fire, create the defenses themselves, the wooden revetments, the gun platforms, the abattis, of course, the barracks, the hospital, all the structures, firewood, of course, 20,000 acres of trees. Absolutely incredible. So the entire circumference of the city was thus protected. And McClellan says that, as I said, by the end of 1861, there's about 48 forts encircling Washington, and that number will only get bigger. And here's where you see another evolution of the defenses of Washington. And what I mean by the, McClellan meant by the circumference of the city was thus protected. Well, here's another image of Fort Pennsylvania, or Fort Reno near Tenleytown. Here is the original fort right there. And then you're going to see the addition of artillery batteries. This was actually a covered way here that was added in 1863, 1864. The engineers in the Army went back in late 1862 after the Maryland campaign. The Secretary of War approved something called the Commission to Study the Defenses. And that's when the engineers rode around the Capitol, took notes, and made suggestions. And they said, we need artillery batteries to cover some major blind spots to the fortifications. Artillery batteries connect the forts. The forts are built 800 to 1,000 yards apart. Many of those were all connected by rifle pits or infantry pits or infantry, trenches. And they started adding artillery batteries to those, basically gun platforms, artillery platforms. Many of those were unarmed. So the idea was if the city came or the forts came under attack, they would move up light artillery from the Capitol to reinforce the line there, okay? So you're going to see the major additions of batteries here. And here's a great example. You've got Fort Reno, you've got Battery Reno, all the connecting earthworks along the line here. And then you'll have Fort Kearny, the next fort in line, another battery, and all the batteries all the way up until Fort DeRussy, right? And all these forts will be engaged in July of 64, by the way. But you see it, Battery Smead, Battery Kingsbury, Battery Terrell, they're all interconnected along the line here. So if the Confederate Army takes an approach towards Washington, they're taking fire from not only the forts, but the artillery batteries as well. And here's a great example. This is near American University. This is a national park site now. Battery Kimball. These guns were aimed at Chain Bridge along the Potomac River. They could reach across into Arlington, Virginia. There were two massive 100-pound Parrott rifles there, all aimed south to protect the Capitol from the northwest, okay? Along the northwest approach to the Capitol. And so you're going to see the Army mount 100-pound Parrott rifles as well, and I'll talk about that in a second. And here's a really great example of what we have in Washington. This is one of my favorite sites. I think they ran out of names, to be honest with you. This was called Battery Left of Rock Creek, literally, Battery Left of Rock Creek, positioned west of Rock Creek in northwest D.C., and you can see the embrasures, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and this was a light artillery battery protecting the Rock Creek Valley into Washington, right behind Military Road. To the west is Fort DeRussy. To the east is Fort Stevens, where the main battle happens at. And you can see here today how well this is preserved. So just give you an idea of what these artillery batteries look like. This is Battery Terrell. Let me go back real quick. It's located south of Military Road, west of Fort Stevens, west of Rock Creek, right there. And if you look closely, you can see the battery, you can see the embrasures. This is a two-gun section here. There's a house behind the earthwork. That's the Peruvian ambassador's residence near Rock Creek Park. Absolutely stunning. This was a few years ago. The ambassador and his family allowed us to come out to see it. It's absolutely incredible. There are connecting earthworks to Fort Kearny that are still surviving as well. He's very proud of the site. I believe he retired now. But we had to get special authority to go out there to see it. But as you can tell, there are earthworks surviving all across the city, mostly in the Rock Creek area. They built blockhouses as well, blockhouses to really protect the rail lines in Northern Virginia, all the way out west and two parts of Western, headed out west and outside of the Capitol. But the rail center, obviously, to make sure they could supply the Army and supply the War Department and things like that, especially with Mosby riding around. He was a serious threat to federal operations in the area. They built these pretty elaborate blockhouses around the rail center. So you'll have a system of defenses around the rail centers, of course. And then you have to protect the bridges little bit like Hickman Bridge in south of Camp Nelson here. This was fortified as well, and I showed this to Kent recently. Here's one of my favorite images. This is literally on the DC side across the Potomac River. They had two howitzers sitting right on top of the bridge. So if the Confederates wanted to make a dash across the river here, good luck, right? So it really shows you every avenue of approach was protected in some way during the course of the war. Not only do you have these smaller guns, but right on top of the hill behind us would have been Battery Kingsbury and a couple artillery batteries as well. All right, I'm going to start moving through this pretty quick here. The defenses south of the Potomac. So we're talking about the Arlington line all the way down to Virginia as well. Very densely packed forts. The immediate threat was this section all the way up until 1863. That will shift during the Maryland campaign, of course. And you can see this is a really great sketch from the Library of Congress. They call them the contours of the Union forts. And you can see how they're shaped all differently, of course. There's Fort Runyon there. You can see the rail line from Long Bridge crossing right through the middle of the fort there. That's why that fort's there, right? And so you can see each fort's shaped a little bit differently. The traditional star-shaped forts like Fort Corcoran. And I want you to keep this image in your mind because I'm going to show you the northern defenses in a second. And you got forts like this. You got Fort C.F. Smith with 30-pound Parrott rifles. You see how open the landscape here. You see the embrasure right there, the gun platforms. The images of the defenses of Washington are absolutely spectacular because you really understand the landscape around Washington. Fort Richardson, early war image in Arlington as well. You can see all the tents behind there, early war image. And as I said, the forts will simply just be further enhanced moving forward here. Right off the GW Parkway, this is an MPS site, Fort Marcy. You can see the 30-pound Parrott rifle there, all the Sibley tents, or some of the tents and not Sibley tents. But just an idea of how elaborate this system was. What about the defenses north of the river? Well, this is what I'm talking about. Look how small these forts are compared to the ones in Virginia. But you see there will be the additions of the batteries here. There's one at Fort Totten. We'll talk about Fort Totten during the Battle of Fort Stevens. And Fort DeRussy. Fort Stevens is right there. It's actually going to be enhanced in 1863, which will be very important during the Battle of Fort Stevens. But relatively small-sized forts north of the Potomac River here. But these forts will see action for 2 days when Juba Early makes his dash against the Capitol. Here's Fort Stevens right here. Look how open the landscape is. I don't live too far away from here, by the way. This is Silver Spring, Maryland. Imagine how much this has changed over the course of the war. This is actually northern D.C. and parts of Silver Spring, Maryland. And this will be the main focal point of the engagement on July 11th and 12th, 64. Okay, this is what I was talking about early. Fort Totten, and you see the addition of 100-pound Parrott rifles. The Army will mount about 16 100-pound Parrott rifles in 1863, which will further extend the range of the defenses of Washington. But literally, these guns can fire up to 3 miles, right? So when Early advances towards the Capitol, he'll be taking artillery fire for over 3 miles before he even sees the forts. We talked about the revetments, those wooden planks that were later replaced by posts. That's exactly what we're talking about. See how open the Maryland landscape is. This is a national park site. Everyone thinks of Fort Totten, the metro station, but this is our site. We actually know where this gun was mounted. And this gun, importantly, would be engaged in action during the Battle of Fort Stevens on the 11th and the 12th. And I'll show you what that looks like when we get to the battle. But a massive 100-pound Parrott rifle. Really, these are the state-of-the-art guns that they add to the Capitol in 1863 and 64. Here's another great image of the defenses. And what I love about this is you see the evolution by just looking at these images. This is near Bladensburg, Maryland in northeast D.C., site of the famous War of 1812 battle. And you can see the 30-pound Parrott rifles sitting on top of the gun platforms. But most importantly, in the corner there, you see the addition of the 100-pound Parrott rifle. So these were all added really in 1863, as I said, 64. They replaced some of the older 24 and 32-pounder Seacoast guns with Parrott rifles, especially 30-pounders and 100-pounders as well. A really great internal image of Fort Lincoln as well. Same fort. You can see the 100-pound Parrott rifle is sitting right there. And all the interior structures. This is probably a well right here. But look how much they transformed the land here, right? These were elaborate system of fortifications. And yeah, you've got soldiers standing by a magazine. That's where the ammunition was stored at. And you can even see the walls were sodded. Absolutely incredible. Some of the walls were sodded. They were supposed to sod more of the walls, really because of erosion and rain. But because of time and expenses, they weren't able to do almost all of them. But some of them were sodded, and you can see they had time to make really cool signs when you enter the Sally Port there. And I'm going to show you what this looks like today. But look how dramatic the wall is. And actually, if you look really closely here, that sign says "Keep off the grass," which is quite hilarious. And that's what we're trying to prevent people from doing today. Okay, I'll talk really quickly about the Eastern Branch Line. This is across the Anacostia River. I said most importantly, it was the Navy Yard and the Arsenal that were across the river. So they built an unconnected system across the river. They were mostly the smaller forts, but they were there because there was a long ridge line about a couple hundred feet above sea level that could shell this area here. So you're going to have some of these fortifications constructed. You can see Fort Carroll. You can see this really big bastion here. Oops, sorry. Which creates that flanking fire across the line here. That's what I was talking about before. And pretty dramatic. Some small artillery pieces here. Very important because this connects with Camp Nelson as well. The Keysboro Horse Depot was the largest horse center for the Eastern armies. Hundreds of thousands of horse were bred here, were obviously rehabbed, re-strengthened here, provided medical care, and most of these horses will serve with the Army of the Potomac during the Civil War. This was located west of Fort Carroll on the Anacostia River. Okay, so this is like post Antietam campaign, and this will this is their response to what will happen if the Confederate Army attacks from Maryland. You see what Barnard says. They can make a sudden effort that way and brought the intervals. Okay, so he's talking about a major dash from Maryland. The zone of immediate threat went from Virginia to the northern defenses, and thankfully they did. What did they do? They added 100-pound Parrott rifles, as I talked about. This is the same image at Fort Totten. You can see the revetments right there. This is a stunning image. Fort Stevens. If you go out to Fort Stevens today, you'll see this really great scale model. This is the original fort. You can tell it's a kind of a standalone fort itself. Less than a 200-yard perimeter. It was called Fort Massachusetts. It was later renamed Fort Stevens after Isaac Stevens. And you can see it was almost doubled in size. So all this was added later in the war. And thankfully it was, because this would come under direct attack in July of '64. So you see all the gun platforms. You've got the bomb-proof. You got the magazine right there. These will all be added later on in the war. Importantly, river defense as well. Now, these are the largest guns mounted in around Washington. Absolutely massive, especially this baby right here. The 15-inch Rodman gun weighed 49,000 pounds. The barrel fired like a 300-round projectile. Needed a 40-pound powder charge to fire the thing. These could penetrate ironclad gunships. So this is located at a battery in Alexandria, right across the river is Fort Foote as well. And you can see this is not a 100-pound Parrott rifle. This is a 200-pound Parrott rifle. So these were the two largest guns that were mounted in Washington. Right across the river, as I said, is Fort Foote, which mounts 15-inch Rodman guns and 200-pound Parrott rifles. They call these model earthworks. These were built in late 1863, and by this point, the Federal Army had really perfected building earthworks around the Capitol. And as you can see, that's a very big gun. We have two original guns at Fort Foote. We named them Honest Abe and Bigfoot. So these were remounted by the Park Service in the 70s and 80s. So if you're ever interested in seeing these guns, I wish you would. Come out and to Fort Foote. It's in Fort Washington, Maryland, along the Potomac River there. And, oh, this is incredible as well. I forgot to mention this. They had a lot of time in Washington, so the majority of the magazines were constructed out of those wooden posts really strong wood that was used for this, but they also had time to create some brick magazines created by some German engineers. Look at this, spectacular. This was taken by me a couple years ago, and these are surviving magazines that we have in the defenses of Washington. Okay, so I'm going to kind of skip through this section real quick. I do want to mention something before we move forward. Here's the original blueprint of Fort Mahon on the Anacostia side, okay? And the reason why I'm showing this is you see the evolution of the forts. This is kind of the regular fort, right? You got some walls here. Check out the difference later on in the war. They start adding those bastions or bastionettes, three-sided, basically protrusions to provide flanking fire along the walls. These will all be added, as I said, later on in the war, just to show you how the engineers are taking progressive steps to enhance the line here. Here's another great image. Here's Fort Carroll, the original shape, kind of like a rectangle in many ways. Well, about six-sided, but mostly it's a relatively small fort. And you can see they started adding these bastions in the corners of the forts here. And we have what this looks like. Remember I showed this image before? This was added later on in the war. So that's what I mean by the addition and the evolution of the defenses. You can see them add these really important strategic additions to the walls. Okay, so let's quickly talk about the Battle of Fort Stevens, July of 1864. I won't get too deep into the campaign here, but we know we have Jubal Early, and he's going to make his really movement towards the Shenandoah starting in mid-June, and then he'll arrive outside Washington in early July, and there's going to be a fight, at the gates of Washington. And I love this really great map of his campaign here. You know, the first thing he's supposed to do is go to Lynchburg and reinforce John Breckinridge, who's under threat from the Federal Army of West Virginia under David Hunter. When he arrived, David Hunter clears the valley. He completely retreats towards West Virginia, which he was not supposed to do, by the way. He was supposed to maintain a federal presence in the Shenandoah Valley right here. When he clears the valley, Early's got the clear path to head north towards the Potomac River. We say going down the valley, and he's going to be unmolested all the way up to the Potomac River. There's going to be a light action at Harper's Ferry, which does slow him down by a full day. But Early in his army, he calls it the Army of the Valley District, formerly the First Corps. They'll cross the Potomac River on July 4th, around Independence Day, 1864, and they'll spend the next several days ransoming towns in southern Maryland until he gets to Frederick, Maryland. So we talked about federal armies in his path. You got David Hunter, the Army of West Virginia. You got Franz Sigel. He's got the Reserve Division of the Army of West Virginia at Harper's Ferry. And I actually think Franz Sigel performs pretty well. He's going to be removed kind of after this campaign, but his men put up quite a bit of a delaying action there, including firing a 100-pound Parrott rifle that was really designed and implemented by John Barnard. And they slow Early's army down by one full day. And then, of course, we know Sweet Lew Wallace at Monocacy with the 8th Army Corps, or the Middle Department. He's going to be the only major force in the way of Early in 1864. So I think it's really interesting. If you see the evolution of the war, you see kind of Grant and then Lincoln's relationship, which was really interesting and dynamic during this time frame. They spent a lot of time messaging each other, of course. Grant sees an opportunity. Lincoln sees an opportunity with this fort detached from Robert E. Lee north of the Potomac River. That's like, hey, we can basically annihilate this force before they ever get back. Lincoln actually wants Grant to come up to take command of all the disjointed forces around Washington to defeat this force. Lincoln says, Grant says, I'm sending up a capable officer, and I'll talk about who that is moving forward. Okay, so this is the fun part of the map, my friends. It becomes a race. Early is going to get outside of Frederick, Maryland. There's going to be that first major battle at Monocacy on July 9th, about 40 miles northwest of Washington. Lew Wallace is going to make his defense along the Monocacy River. His goal is obviously to protect Washington and Baltimore. That's where his headquarters are supposed to be at. He makes his presence in the field that day, and they're going to duke it out with Lew Wallace's, with Jubal Early's army for about 8 full hours on July 9th. But reinforcements are on the way, because we got a 3rd Division of the 6th Corps under James Rickett. He gets sent all the way to Baltimore, and from there they're sent up by train. Two of his brigades will be fighting at Monocacy, and they provide the backbone for Lew Wallace's defense that day. And they fight really their hearts out. They're the reason why Lew Wallace holds out for so long. And I think it's really important to understand that the Sixth Corps is on the field because Early realizes that he ran into the veteran army of the Potomac. He doesn't know how many troops are coming, but he realizes that he's running out of time. The other two divisions of the Sixth Corps will be sent directly to Washington. The question is, will they get in time? They're in time to defend the capital. You know, the majority of the troops have been stripped out of D.C. U.S. Grant has taken about 25,000 heavy artillery soldiers from Washington during the course of his overland campaign. There's supposed to be at least 35,000 men in the city at all times. It really shows how much is on the line in 1864 for Grant, for Lincoln, and his administration. And there's elements of the 19th Corps from the Department of the Gulf that are supposed to reinforce Grant at Petersburg. They arrive on their transport ships, and he sends them up to Washington as well. So as I said, it becomes a race, especially after the Battle of Monocacy on July 9th, which will slow down Early by a full day. The very next day, Early will start advancing towards Washington. So this is one of my favorite quotations, and it's Lew Wallace's report to the War Department, which is received by the War Department 11:40 p.m. on July 9th after the Battle of Monocacy. And he's like, I fought the enemy at Frederick Junction from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. When they overwhelmed me with numbers, I'm retreating with a footsore, battered, half-demoralized column. Forces of the enemy at least 20,000. They do not seem to be pursuing. This is my favorite part. You will have to use every exertion to save Baltimore and Washington. I think the troops of the Sixth Corps fought magnificently. I was totally overwhelmed by a force from the direction of Harper's Ferry arriving during the battle. Two fresh regiments of the Sixth Corps are recovering to my retreat. I will try to get to Baltimore. So I think what's really important about that is, go back to this map, when Lew Wallace is defeated, he does not head towards Washington. He's cut off. He has to head back to Baltimore. So as he says, you'll have to make every exertion to save Washington. There's no one else in the way. Every army that was in the area was gone. David Hunter's trying to make his way back from West Virginia, but he does not arrive in time. And that Ricketts' entire division will be forced to retreat with Lew Wallace's column or men during after the battle. So it's going to come down from the troops in Washington, the Veteran Reserve Corps, formerly the Invalid Corps, government clerks. There's going to be National Guard troops that sign up for 100 days. And they're going to try to hold out long enough before the Sixth Corps arrives on the field. Okay, so they call this the battle that saved Washington. In many ways, I believe that. They slow it down. As I said, it's an 8-hour fight. Early's men are pretty exhausted, right? They've been marching for almost a month now, over 300 miles, and they still have to get to Washington. The temperature has been hot and humid in the 90s, and he's going to start marching his men the very next day. Okay, so a really great image. You can see here that the Sixth Corps is fighting on the left flank. When they're cut off, this route to D.C. is wide open. 270, you can see 270 right there. All right, let's talk about this kind of route to Washington. So I think this is really important. So this is this is Jubal Early's report to Robert E. Lee just a few days after the Battle of Fort Stevens. And you can see the route he takes when his army, 40 miles to go, they're going to be strung out for 10 miles on the way to D.C. At Rockville, his men split up. His infantry heads to the east, and then his cav continues down Wisconsin Avenue towards Tenleytown and outside of the Georgetown area towards D.C. But you can see what he says. On the morning of the 11th, that's the first day of the battle, we continued the march, but the day was so excessively hot, even in the very early morning, the dust so dense that many of the men fell by the way, and it became necessary to slacken our pace. Nevertheless, when we reached the right of the enemy's fortifications, we were almost completely exhausted and not in a condition to make an attack. I think we've all read a lot about Jubal Early, and especially his post-war writing, and he loved to exaggerate, right? I think he's actually spot on here. His men are absolutely exhausted. They had gotten really punched in their face during the Battle of Monocacy. They got back up and knocked out Wallace, but hey, he took a lot of casualties that day, and they had to make this 40-mile march exhausted towards the capital. And by the time they get outside Washington, they're going to start taking heavy artillery fire. And by the time they get too close to the forts or close enough, reinforcements will have arrived, including at Fort Reno, which is right there. You can see it. It's the highest point in Washington, about 300 feet above sea level. I always laugh about that because I'm from Colorado myself, and 300 feet, come on. But there's also a large signal tower there. So the federal signal station can see the enemy movement from Rockville because of the dust columns. But most importantly, John McCausen's cav will approach the Rockville Road or Wisconsin Avenue all the way to Washington. There's going to be some light engagement along the forts on this side, but the concentration force will be the infantry going down the 7th Street Road from Silver Spring, Maryland, towards Fort Stevens, and that's where the major action will happen. The main sector of fighting, my friends, Fort DeRussy east across Rock Creek to Fort Stevens and Fort Slocum. Fort Totten will provide some artillery support as well. So I call this the high watermark of Jubal Early's raid on Washington. The enemy is within 20 rods, about 110 yards of Fort Stevens. You can see the time there. The 6th Corps had to arrive, by the way, off the Potomac River by noon. It would take them hours to reach the northern defenses, but there were other reinforcements of really other unorganized troops, basically, that were kind of patched together, what they call these provisional brigades, right? Elements of the USCT, other troops that were in training camps. They were all put together and sent to the northern defenses, and they will arrive in time to push Early back about 1,000 yards north of Fort Stevens. And so this is Fort Stevens itself. I love this image because you're going to see a lot of great things. Here's the northeast section of the fort. Why is this so important? Here's the 7th Street Road. Silver Spring is back here. This is where the Confederate Army will be marching on both sides of the road. We now call this Georgia Avenue. They called it the 7th Street Road back then. This is where the main sector of fighting will happen around this area. We now know Walter Reed National Medical Center is in this area as well. So we talked about Fort Stevens earlier, the original fort, the expansion. I show this image again because this is the famous tree where Lincoln will be at, so think about that. We'll talk about that in a second. Early's high watermark, we talked about that, really along both sides of the 7th Street Road at Fort Stevens, but really importantly, there's all these supporting forts in the way that are going to be providing mutual battery support. Fort Reno has a 100-pound Parrott rifle. Fort DeRussy has a 100-pounder. It's firing in this direction. Fort Todd has a 100-pound Parrott rifle. They're all firing at multiple directions towards the enemy columns, okay? So Early is taking fire all the way across the line, and then you can see when the 6th Corps arrives in the evening time, Early's got no chance to break into Washington. And again, you see the 100-pound Parrott rifles coming into effect here. This is why they were really installed in 1863, and they will serve their purpose during the battle. This is, again, at Fort Totten. You can see it's firing this direction, northwest, in support of Fort Stevens along the 7th Street Road. Okay, so Early has his council of war at Silver Spring, Maryland, and he sees the next day there's troops, mostly the 6th Corps. He realizes he's got no chance to take the capital. I think what's important, we'll talk about Lincoln. We believe it was out there both days, July 11th and 12th of 1864. He's out there around noon on the 11th when he hears that the 6th Corps has arrived at the Potomac River. He rides down to greet the soldiers, and there's a lot of fanfare and enthusiasm from the citizens and things like that. And then he arrives again on the 12th. He's escorted to the front by General Horatio Wright of the 6th Corps. That's the trusted officer that Grant sent up. And there's going to be a surgeon standing up to Lincoln that's wounded in the leg. And this is where obviously all the mythology around Lincoln at Fort Stevens comes up. Someone says, get down, you fool, get down, you damn fool. Everyone said that they were there and saw Lincoln under fire. Of course, everyone wants to be connected to Abraham Lincoln, but he was under direct enemy fire and will be removed from the fort and taken back to the White House. It's a really, really interesting scene. But the battle is not in. The battle ends the evening of July 12th when two brigades under the command of General Frank Wheaton attack north from Fort Stevens to attack really the enemy rear guard as Early's trying to protect his retreat out of Washington. But there's going to be some heavy fighting near where Walter Reed Medical Center is. And my office is actually at Battleground National Cemetery. It's appropriately called Battleground because the majority of the fighting will take place here. The majority of the Federal and Confederate casualties will be taken north of Fort Stevens as well. But by 10 o'clock, Washington's redeemed, and Early's been forced to retreat from Washington. And here's another great map of the action as well. They're really going into Robert Rhodes's division around Walter Reed and Battleground National Cemetery, both sides of Georgia Avenue. Okay, so let's talk quickly about the end of the Civil War. What happens to D.C.? Well, the forts are kept around. About 20 of them are kept around until 1866. Some of them, they're kept on they're called first-class forts, including Fort Stevens, Fort Reno, things like that. But the majority of them will be dismantled. They'll take all the guns out, of course, the powder, and then the government will auction off a lot of the wood and other property, the barracks, to the civilians to kind of replenish the treasury coffers. And that's why the majority of the forts were destroyed by the plowshare, farmers after the war. And you can see that at Camp Nelson as well, especially along the northern defenses. Most of those forts were destroyed after the war as peace returned to the landscape. Okay, this is a great image. And this shows you how much erosion and how much things had changed after the Civil War. You can see the trees have grown back to the walls. These are the earthworks, by the way. The Army took out the revetments, the wooden posts and planks, right? So the walls eroded. Obviously, there was farming. There was 50 years of weather, et cetera, et cetera. This is at Fort Stevens, the Fort Stevens. We know the time frame because this boulder, which was taken off the battlefield, was dedicated in 1911 as the spot where Lincoln was under direct enemy fire. And you can see there, November 11th, 1911. Here's the local historian that helps really purchase the land from this woman here, Elizabeth Thomas. She's an African-American woman that owned property where Fort Stevens was constructed. And she'll sell plots of her land in order for them to dedicate a battlefield park, which we have here today. They'll put the boulder up, and then they'll put a plaque on in 1920. But what do we have here today? Well, I love this as well. A really unique, this is another really interesting post-war story. Fort Stevens was reconstructed by the Civilian Conservation Corps in 1937 and 1938. So I think it's a new era, New Deal, right? FDR. A lot of these men obviously will serve with the U.S. Military during World War II, but the fort was rebuilt during this period. Okay, so this is important to understand as well. You hear Fort Drive quite a bit. You hear Fort Circle Parks. And I found this from the Evening Star in 1896, that early. And the idea was to build this grand boulevard around the defenses of Washington from the north, east, all the way down to the south, connecting all the forts, and people could take their carriages out, right, and enjoy history and nature kind of a thing. They wanted to make a boulevard comparable to like Paris and then in other parts of Europe. And so that's the plan for Fort Drive. And there's different iterations of it, and it never really happened because of urban growth, World War I, World War II, the Great Depression, obviously. But the government was able to purchase land in the 1930s, including Fort Stevens, and you have this here today. So everything in blue you see is protected or managed by the National Park Service. And look at that. That's the line, right? That's Fort Drive or Fort Circle Parks. I mean, you don't have one road that connects everything, but really the foundation of it is here today. And these are all the sites managed by the Park Service. And you've got some other sites managed by Arlington County and then in Alexandria as well. So compared to what we had back in 1865, the fact that we have really close to 30 remnant earthworks of varying degrees of preservation, we're very fortunate to have really any of this left. Okay, so real quickly, what we have here today, as I said, we have Fort Stevens reconstructed. You can see the magazine right there. You can see the vertical wooden posts reconstructed, made out of cement, actually, an artillery piece. So we do our commemoration there every single year. This is Battleground National Cemetery, one of the smallest cemeteries in the country. It's only for soldiers from the Battle of Fort Stevens, federal soldiers, of course. We give programs there. We do luminaries. We do Memorial Day, things like that. I get dressed up sometimes, and we take students and education programs out to the woods, of course. And you're going to see what the forts look like today. Much like Fort Jones in Camp Nelson, this is Fort Gerusi. You can see the historic earthworks there. Obviously, the best time to see earthworks are in the wintertime. And so we're getting close to that time now, and during this image, of course. And so we take groups out there. If you're ever interested in coming out to DC to see the defenses, let me know. I'd love to take you out for free of charge, of course. And you can enjoy the defenses of Washington, learn all about their design and what we have here to left, what we have left. Obviously, we do a lot of programming at Fort Stevens, which is our main site. It's completely surrounded by a neighborhood, so we're very fortunate to have this. As I said, we have our commemoration every year. It's generally the second Saturday of July, of course. Looks like we'll be going virtual this year. And like many of the parks in the Civil War MPS world, we have interns from different colleges, including Gettysburg College. We do, firing demonstrations, things like that, of course. There's a lot of Civil War history on Washington, so I'm very fortunate to do programs across the city, including at some of these circles we call them. This is Logan Circle, where their monument to John A. Logan was at, obviously a Western Theater soldier. His house is actually right across the street. This was a camp during the Civil War called Camp Barker for U.S. cavalry. It later became a contraband camp for enslaved people. 40 to 50,000 came into the city during the Civil War. So we did a programming there. I did a program at the African American Civil War Memorial, which is right across the street from the African American Civil War Museum. This is also this monument is managed by the National Park Service, and so we did the end of the program was here from Logan Circle all the way to here. It was a spectacular program. History at Sunset. We do programs, as you can see at Fort Stevens here. We try to bring out as many people as we can to our sites. If you're lucky, you can meet Abraham Lincoln and tell him to get down your fool yourself. And this was a few years ago, of course. And we're doing kind of the then and now images, trying to work with technology. Of course, they really connect people to how much the landscape has changed, obviously, in Washington. So this is kind of the image that we showed you earlier, superimposed on what we have at Fort Stevens here today. You can see the flagpole is kind of put in a different position. That's the tree where Lincoln was at along the wall here. The monument's right over here. And I showed you this before. Look what Fort Totten looks like today. So I call this natural reclamation, where nature has just reclaimed the landscape, of course, right? Especially the men moved all the soil. That introduces like a lot of invasive plant species and stuff. And you can see it's just overgrown. If you recall, I mean, the wall was probably around here, and look how much it's eroded over the course of the past century and a half, right? So it's pretty spectacular what we can see here today. Okay, and we're still working on things. Here's Battery Kimball. As I said, an MPS site. You see the earthwork right there. I believe this image was from the 1970s, because you can see the stone there with the plaque. The issue was the plaque was missing. We found it again, covered by a bunch of brush. You can see the 4 points where the plaque was at. Someone had, I think, stolen it maybe 20, 30 years ago. And we went back in and I wrote the text for it. And we had this installed in late 2020. And here are my friends from the maintenance department. And you can see the earthworks in the back there. We've done some earthwork restoration. And we're very fortunate. This is one of my proudest moments for the defenses. We were able to get this installed after it's been missing for years. And there it is, Battery Kimball, one of the defenses of Washington. And you can see I'm very happy hugging the rock, because this was a very, very proud and happy day. But, we're trying to connect people with the defenses of Washington as much as we can. And so we hope that we can get you out to DC. That concludes the program. There's the website, of course, our Facebook page, which I manage, and we also have an Instagram page. If you have any questions, Ken's got my email. I'll be happy to respond and contact, to reach out to anyone. Love to give you a tour of DC, and that's it. Ken, I turn it back to you.
Absolutely wonderful, Steve. Just wonderful. Listen, we have some questions coming up. So, AJ?
Yes, the first question, Steve, is, was there a lot of flooding around the exterior of the forts?
Yeah, that's a great question, because if you go, sometimes if you go to some of the forts, if you look into the ditch, there's quite a bit of water within the ditches themselves, right? So there's a little bit of flooding, but actually not as much as I originally thought. As I said, they're mostly designed on pretty high ground here. But the biggest issue with the rain was just erosion of the walls. And so they were very difficult to maintain. The thing about earthworks, it's really funny, because when I take people out and we talk about forts, they expect to see Fort Sumter out in the middle of the woods, right? They want to see stone forts, They want to see those magnificent, third system fortifications that you see along the coastline. But these are earthworks. They're temporary. They were pretty cheap to make. They were easy to make in regards to, it takes a lot of manpower, of course. But these were only temporary. And General Barnard says that these were only supposed to be up during the duration of the war, the national emergency, which was the war, of course. And then they turned everything back to the original landowners. So you can imagine there's been quite a bit of erosion over the past 150 years. Some are better than others. I'm actually going out to one of our forts tomorrow, Fort Jerusi, to work on a social trail because people love to climb the walls, right? And we're trying to keep people off the walls to keep these better protected.
Well, and Steve, what about during the war itself? Were there any major storms that might have hit D.C. that caused erosion of the forts during the war?
No, nothing that I have come across. The thing was, General Barnard, being a very conscientious engineer, he was never satisfied totally with the defenses of Washington. So every time there was an action around Washington, so Second Manassas, Chantilly, they brought him back, and he's riding around and sending troops and batteries here and there. Obviously, during the Maryland campaign, he's overseeing the expansion of the defenses. He talks about the erosion of the walls, weeds, and all this other stuff growing up in front of the forts, that they need to cut down more trees to clear the fields of fire and things like that. So I don't have any major accounts of a major storm affecting the forts, but he does talk quite a bit about erosion, of course, with the water. And, he wanted the walls all sodded, and that only happened, as I said, at a couple places. And so he was never fully satisfied. Even during the Battle of Fort Stevens, he's like, these aren't good enough. These aren't strong enough, right? But I actually think this forts did really, really well during the Battle of Fort Stevens. And actually, I forgot to read this. And let me read this I think this is really important to understand. And this comes from a Confederate officer. And I believe this is the best description of the defenses of Washington from an enemy combatant. Let me see if I actually have it here. Give me 1 second. Okay. Okay. So this officer gets to Washington on July 11th with the rest of the Confederate Army, and this is how he describes the defenses of Washington. Skirmishers were thrown out and moved up to the vicinity of the fortification. These we found to be very strong and constructed very scientifically. They consist of a circle of enclosed forts connected by breastworks with ditches, palisades, and abattis in front, and every approach swept by a crossfire of artillery, including some heavy guns. What a description, right? And you know who wrote that? Jubal Early to Robert E. Lee. Spectacular. And so he did not realize how many forts were not in the forts. Obviously, they were undermanned during that battle until the Sixth Corps arrived, but they served their purpose. They're kind of a deterrent, right? He couldn't see how many men were in the forts, but they're taking heavy fire. He describes them as scientifically designed by the engineers. He's spot on. So I love that description from Jubal Early because that talks about how well they built the forts.
Steve, you mentioned Lincoln at Fort Stevens.
Yes, sir.
General Wright had on his staff another fellow who cut quite a figure.
He did.
And that was Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. At Fort Stevens. And, of course, he'd be appointed by Theodore Roosevelt to the Supreme Court of the United States. But Oliver Wendell Holmes had a remarkable career in the Civil War.
He did. And, every time I bring up Lincoln at Fort, everyone brings up Oliver Wendell Holmes, right? Which makes sense. He has this pretty incredible military career, obviously served in the Supreme Court later.
Yeah.
I'm not even sure if he was there, to be honest. Obviously, he was a staff officer to General Wright.
Right.
But I had an intern do more research on this, and it appeared that it was only after his death that people close to him started really kind of highlighting that account or that story, right? So was he there? Maybe. The African-American woman that owned the property there, she said she was in Fort Stevens telling Lincoln to get down, you damn fool. I don't believe she was in the fort. And the only reason why, because we believe Lincoln came to Fort Stevens with Mary Todd and the Secretary of War as well. And I found an account said that they wouldn't allow women in the fort during the battle, right?
Yeah.
So, but you can imagine every single soldier that had a pen or pencil wrote that they saw Lincoln under fire, that they told him to get down, you fool, right? It's really absolutely incredible. And I got to share that account from the 6th Corps guys that arrived off the Potomac River. You know, they said Lincoln's down there and he's very excited. And he tells the soldiers, if you run into the Confederates, make sure you tell them that this is only the beginning of reinforcement, that there's more coming. And this is the famous line where he tells the soldiers, you can't be late if you want to get early, right? And everyone's laughing in the ranks, right? So, Lincoln's like deeply connected to the Battle of Fort Stevens, which is great for us, right? Because they saved the battlefield really because of his connection to it. At my cemetery that I work at, the monuments talk about Lincoln. One of the monuments literally says, and you guys will love this because it talks about what the men are thinking when these monuments are dedicated, right? Mm-hmm. And I believe it's a Pennsylvania regiment, and it says, in defense of the Capitol, in the presence of Abraham Lincoln. So they had to make sure that Lincoln was in the monument, right? So it's such a fantastic account. But oh my gosh, and I think what's really important about this, Ken, is the 6th Corps, they don't leave the area, right? Mm-hmm. They're going to be joined by elements of the 19th Corps, elements of the Army of West Virginia. They're going to chase after Jubal Early, which leads to the Battle of Cool Springs a week later. Then obviously we have Chambersburg, and then we have one and only Phil Sheridan being sent up to command all the troops in the new Middle Military Department. And those troops will remain with him until the end of the winter there, right? Or the end of the fall. So, the preeminent expert on the defense is Dr. Benjamin Franklin Cooling Jr. Right. And I love how he describes this. The 64 campaigns are just one evolution after the another, right? And so you've got the Overland campaign, you got Franz Sigel going up the valley, or down the valley, excuse me. I guess it is up the valley. And then you've got Early, later in June and July. And then you got Sheridan going out there, right? I mean, this keeps on going and going and going. So, it's really really incredible to understand the defense of Washington from that perspective. Because as you talked about, Kent, when I first learned of the defense of Washington, because you see this through the lens of the Army of the Potomac commanders, right? Mm-hmm. And all of them complain that they're hearing messages from Halleck and Stanton saying, you have to protect Washington, you have to keep men in Washington, be sure to keep your men between Washington and the enemy, right? And so the forts seem a bit static, but I don't think they are. And you see how much they grew during the course of the war. And I forgot to give the final numbers, by the way. So we go from 48 forts in 1861 to 60 at the end of 1863. By the end of the Civil War, there are 68 major forts around Washington, 98 artillery batteries, 30 miles of military road, 35 miles of earthworks. They mounted 800 artillery pieces. Wow. So when we talk about one of the most heavily fortified cities in the world, that's exactly what we mean, Ken.
Wow. Well, let me end on this. Your talk was absolutely wonderful.
Appreciate that, my friend.
Wonderful. And Steve, thank you so much. But I do have to end with this. My dear wife Genevieve comes from Washington D.C.
That's right.
And her house stood on the corner of Cathedral and Foxhall.
Yes.
Directly across the street from Battery Kemble.
Right.
And that is where she went sleigh riding, is up and down the sides of Battery Kemble. So,
well, the great thing about that, Kent, is that hill is still there, of course. It's very popular sledding. It's actually become a very popular dog park. And the fortunate thing for us is the earthworks are on top of the hill and right off the road there, but no one really knows what they're at. And so they've been preserved actually quite well over the past century and a half. And that's where you see that marker we put up, that tablet, really marking the spot. So I can imagine young Genevieve on top of a sleigh going down that gigantic hill. People still do it today, my friends. So it's a very popular sledding spot.
Listen, Thank you again. And
Thank you
we'll
so
see
much.
you back here soon, okay?
Yeah, I hope so. Look forward to being back in Kentucky sometime soon, and look forward to seeing if anyone makes it out to Washington. Just let me know. I'd love to show them around the defenses of Washington.
Wonderful,
Thank you, Steve.
wonderful, wonderful. Well, everybody, listen, this has been a lot of fun. Thank you all for tuning in. Remember that Monday, September 13, we begin the new campaign. And we'll slog our way through September 13, and we'll then go to Monday, November 22nd. So we're back to the in-person meetings and all the camaraderie that we love. So, folks, listen, everybody have a great summer. You have a great summer, too. And you, AJ.
And you as well.
And we'll see you in the fall.
Thank you all.